Good morning, everyone. My name is Glenn Gomolka. I'm the CEO of the Community Foundation Mississauga. It's my pleasure to welcome all of our attendees and panelists to today's Vital Conversation. Today's session is the third and the final installment of our Vital Conversation series on exploring the challenges faced by newcomers in our city. Recordings of the previous session are already available on our Vital Conversation page on our website, and today's session will be recorded and added to our webpage later today. Today's conversation is going to explore the affordable housing challenges in Mississauga, but with a particular focus on newcomers and other vulnerable groups. We're lucky today to have Jessica Kwik as our moderator. Jessica is the director at the Peel Newcomer Strategy Group with a local immigration, with the Peel Newcomer Strategy Group, which is a local immigration partnership project in Peel. Jessica is also a representative of the Inclusive Local Economic Opportunity Initiative of the United Way of Greater Toronto. So Jessica has a great deal of knowledge and expertise in all matters related to newcomers and housing that she's going to bring to today's session. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Jessica, who will introduce our other panelists and lead us through the remainder of our conversation. I hope everybody enjoys today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and really excited about this gathering. I'll just mention that one of the projects that was mentioned is the Inclusive Local Economic Opportunity Initiative. And it's a wonderful collaboration of public, private, and community coming together, much like we're gathering today. And there are 5 pilots right now in Scarborough in the Greater Golden Mile neighborhood. That includes community-owned construction, as well as good jobs, training, and employment, and a pilot that is addressing affordable housing through the retention of legacy units. And if others want to find more information, you can go to the website ileo.org and to learn more. Without further ado, I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. And as we're talking about affordable housing, we can also think about that in the context of creating homes and welcoming communities. And Indigenous communities were the first to set that tradition of welcoming newcomers. So we want to just acknowledge that we are gathering together on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, where the land has been cared for thousands of years through generations, in particular the territory of the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwa Chippewa peoples, and the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so how can we reciprocate back to the Indigenous communities? I think we can pay back some of that debt by achieving the 94 calls to action that were issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a timely way. So we're going to be talking about that in the context of affordable housing in today's context in Mississauga. And we'll be looking at that through the lens of populations like newcomers and their experiences as they arrive. So we're going to be taking about an hour to talk about this, and we'll dedicate some time for questions and answers as well. So please feel free to use the Q&A section, which you'll find at the bottom bar, to ask questions for the speakers. We'll also use the chat box as well and try to accommodate as many questions as we can. So I'll start by introducing our really illustrious sponsor, Novo Nordisk. Thank you so much for the opportunity to host the Vital Conversation series. The Community Foundation of Mississauga has had really great success in bringing people together around pressing needs and issues impacting the city of Mississauga, and really showcasing thought leaders and community activators through this forum to exchange ideas and opinions and solutions. And today in our audience, we have guests from all walks of life, from the city of Mississauga and Peel region, including residents, community groups, and charitable organizations, other sectors, donors, and philanthropists. And I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists. We have 2, I would say, real thought leaders in the area. We have Aileen Baird, who is the Director of Housing Services at the region of Peel. Welcome, Aileen. And she is Council's Delegated Service Manager for Peel's affordable housing system. And you can read more of her bio there. And she holds a master's in public administration from Carleton. We're so lucky to have her expertise and passion, compassion that she shows in her public service. So thank you so much, Aileen. We also have Doug Kwan as well from the Advocacy and Legal Services of the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario. Welcome, Doug. He'll be speaking more from his perspective of the Community Legal Clinic, which has a provincial focus. And he's had many years' experience in Mississauga with Mississauga Community Legal Services as co-executive director. So I'm really excited to have Doug's perspective here as well. So welcome to you both. Just to start us off, we're going to be talking about the housekeeping is just making sure that all mics and videos stay off for now until we have the question period, where we will have an open floor through the Q&A section as mentioned. So thank you again for that. I'm going to change now to some of the background statistics around affordable housing for Mississauga, but also a significant number of cities in Canada. So a recent report from the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation indicated that household debt is at its highest, and it's more debt than any other country in the G7, and the amount owed is more than the value of the country's entire economy. So experts note that household debt can be directly attributed to mortgage debts in the country. You know, if we think about homes, the average price is over $1 million now, according to September 2023's Mississauga Real Estate Board. So if you can think about how that can be out of reach, not just for those who live currently and growing up in Peel, but those who are coming as newcomers, that is unreasonable for people to reach home ownership. On the other hand, if we think about rental rates, unfortunately, we're not seeing much relief there either, as we saw for the October rental rates from rentals.ca and Urban Nation. Mississauga has the 5th highest rental rates in Canada. And particularly as for newcomers, this is the first way that people are finding housing. This can be a significant strain as people try to settle. So we're going to turn to our panelists to talk about this further as we think about affordable housing and how it disproportionately affects newcomers and other vulnerable groups. Unaffordable rents are one part of the piece of the puzzle. And so we'll talk to Aileen and Doug to get their perspective. So Aileen, maybe first, what are some of the major forces contributing to the issue of unaffordability in housing?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. It's my privilege and honor to be with you to engage in this important discussion. So just want to reiterate a couple key points. We are in an affordable housing crisis in Peel. You've heard some of the statistics that Jessica shared. Peel's not alone in this. We are like all major urban centers across Canada and around the world. So we are in crisis. So in Peel, just to add a few more stats before I get into some of the reasons how we got here as a community, we do estimate now that it takes an average household in Peel region about 30 years to save for an affordable mortgage. And that number actually jumps to 50 years for minimum wage households. So that's a staggering number to take 30 years, you know, to be able to save now for an affordable mortgage. You heard Jessica mention rents. So average rents in Peel now consume entire paychecks for minimum wage households, increasing the risk of homelessness in our community. And we're seeing the effects of that through increased use of food banks, for example, as more families are struggling to be able to pay their rent and also feed their families and meet some of their other needs. Through the research that we do in housing services at the region of Peel, we estimate that there's about 91,000 households in Peel in core housing need. So core housing need means that there's 91,000 who are today living unaffordably or unsuitably for their situation. And we know that newcomers are at more risk of being in core housing need substantially more risk at being in core housing need compared to others. So the crisis is inequitable and it is unprecedented. We're seeing in our shelter system an increase in use amongst families and youth, and we estimate approximately 4,000 unique households used PL's shelter system in the last year. So when we talk about the major forces that's contributing to this lack of affordability, it's a bit of a complex story and it didn't materialize overnight. So this affordability crisis has been decades in the making. It can actually be traced back to the global financial crisis of 2008. And we know that since that time, housing prices and rents have increased more than 3 times household incomes, right? So that's that affordability challenge. Incomes haven't kept up with the prices of housing, both home ownership and rents. And so the gap between household income and the cost of rent or the cost of a home is just growing. The gap continues to grow. So that is the crux of the matter. More and more people, low income and a growing number of middle income, cannot afford homes in Peel region. So a crisis that's decades in the making. Why? There's no one reason. It's sort of a mix of many things have contributed to our current state of affairs. But just to say a few things, supply limitations are part of the problem. And we certainly see today the provincial and federal government creating an emphasis on building more supply. But we also, it's the type of supply. It's not just the amount of supply, but it's the type of supply that matters. So we have limited supply and we have a lack of purpose-built rental in our community. So we're not seeing a lot of new purpose-built rental being built. And we haven't seen that for several years now. Another reason why we're in the state we're in is because of the growing presence of investors in the market. There's now a number of people who buy homes not to live in them, but their homes are an investment vehicle, and the number of investors that are in the market now is actually affecting prices. So that's part of the problem. There's also been a number of federal and provincial land tax and social policy decisions that have sort of resulted in, again, the state that we're in. And if you go back in history, particularly for the vulnerable, you go back to the 1970s and some important decisions that were made there that are contributing to today's problems. And certainly in Canada, we saw the federal government sort of remove themselves from the social housing space. So that's housing that's provided by the nonprofit sector. And in Ontario, which is different from the rest of the country, we had the province actually remove themselves from this space and download the responsibility for social housing to 47 service managers. And when they downloaded that responsibility, it didn't come with sufficient funding. And at that time, there was a number of projects that were canceled. So just to conclude my thoughts on this question, the point I'm trying to make is this has been a crisis that's been decades in the making, and it's been caused by a number of factors.
Thanks so much, Aileen, and definitely a layered issue. So thanks for sharing some of that. And Doug, from your unique rights and advocacy lens, can you share some of your thoughts on the major forces as well?
Yes, completely. Thank you very much to Community Foundation of Mississauga for inviting me, and thank you for the question, Jessica. Just jumping on what Aileen has said, we agree income inequality and the lack of funds available to purchase a home and rent a home is certainly a factor. That's one of 4 factors that we've identified at the legal clinic, which is a community legal clinic that has a provincial focus to advance tenants' rights, which is what we do at ACTO. So what we've seen over the years that the cost of a living wage in the GTA is $25.05, but the minimum wage in the province is $16.55. We've also seen social assistance rates not increasing to an amount that brings respect and dignity. Still, a single adult is only receiving $800 per month, which really is impossible, almost nearly impossible to find a suitable place to live for someone on social assistance. We've also, the second factor we've seen is financialization of housing. Aileen touched upon this, where we're seeing more investors involved in the housing market. We're seeing real estate investment trusts being very aggressive in pursuing profits. That's amounted to more above guideline rent increases, rent evictions, dem evictions that are happening across the province. We're seeing that new builds that are being created, that 87% of those new builds from 2016 to 2021 are for luxury rentals, and those are defined as $3,000 for a month for rent and up. The third factor that we've seen is also, touching upon what Aileen has said, is that government has stopped building housing, and especially social housing, transitional housing, rent-geared income housing, which is something that the private market hasn't produced at all sufficiently. And in fact, the private market over the last 25 years, I should say 30 years, has really produced only owner-occupied units, which are condos, townhouses, and detached homes. And only about 10% of all those new units were purpose-built. So governments stepped away from the housing file. We've seen the federal government step in only recently with the National Housing Strategy, but really that has been a major factor. And lastly, the last factor that we've identified as a source of unaffordability is that we have two large rent control exemptions that are impacting the market. The one being that where a unit is empty, a landlord can charge whatever rent that they wish for those prospective tenants. And also any new unit built after November 15, 2018, that building or unit is exempt from rent control forever. And so as a result, what we're seeing is that between 2016 to 2021, Ontario saw a 27% increase in rent during those 5 years, despite the fact that we've also experienced historically low inflation over that same period of time.
Thank you so much, Doug. And I'm just building on that point, where newcomers, they're still coming to cities like Mississauga, and they're coming still in quite large numbers due to the admission levels, but also that the city attracts folks who want that community connection that they have. It's a great geographic location and a lot of opportunities. And when they come, they're more likely to rent. So it's imperative that those rights are protected. So maybe I'll start with you, Aileen. If you can share maybe some ways that there could be potentially some advocacy to ensure the rights of tenants are safeguarded and newcomers are well informed about common rental laws.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'll start with how to ensure newcomers are well aware, and I think that's key, is awareness. And so this happens today in our community, but it's important that settlement services and the agencies that newcomers are connecting with, how this is part of their service offering, right? So, and this happens today. There are staff with the skills, they understand the environment, and part of the service they provide to newcomers to navigate this environment is to provide a good overview of the landlord-tenant legislation and the rights they have as tenants in this province. So I think it's essential that settlement services continues to provide this support. I also want to say that our team at the Region Appeal provides that support as well. So if newcomers are reaching out to housing services in order to try to secure some subsidy or other supports for affordable housing, this is part of the service that we provide as well. And we also at times will be an advocate on people's behalf, right? We find that that's an important part of supporting newcomers and other vulnerable populations when they're moving across and trying to have conversations with landlords. At times they need an advocate and somebody who's there with them. And so that's, I think, again, an important service. In terms of advocacy, this is an active part of what we do as the Region Appeal and as the service manager for affordable housing. And so we advocate on an ongoing basis at both a political level and at a staff level. So what I mean by that is our regional chair, as well as the mayors of Mississauga. The Region Appeal is comprised of Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon, and I know our focus is on Mississauga today, but the mayor of Mississauga is actively involved in moving forward council-endorsed advocacy positions that are designed to enhance our system and our ability to serve the vulnerable. So the notion of rent controls and other issues are part of a number of positions that the region has, that we look for opportunities to advocate to the province and the federal government. So we really go from politician to politician and advocate at the provincial level, or sorry, at the political level. But we also do this as part of my role as the Director of Housing Services, and certainly my boss, Sean Baird, who's the Director of the Commissioner of Human Services. We are actively working with our peers at the province and the federal government as well, in order to influence policy decisions and funding decisions. I think there's real opportunities, though, for us to partner with the local municipalities as well as a nonprofit sector to have a collective voice in advocacy. And this is something we're getting a little more intentional about, because when we come forward as a collective and we have a shared voice, that can be stronger than just any one of our organizations sort of speaking individually. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to what Doug has to say about this as well.
Thank you so much, Aileen. So much work on that. So thank you so much. And Doug, do you have anything to add? And we can also talk a little bit about the landlord and tenant board as well, and thinking about issues that you may have seen come up there.
Sure. Thank you. Just to add a couple of points, settlement agencies are usually the first point of contact for newcomers. They're trusted intermediaries, so they play an important part in ensuring that newcomers are given the right tools and education in terms of what their rights are. In the community legal clinic system, there is a legal clinic that serves Mississauga as well as North Peel, Brampton and Caledon as well. And that's a Mississauga Community Legal Services, which offers tenants' rights presentations. So encourage agencies and groups to reach out to them for that presentation. There's also an agency called the Community Legal Education Network of Ontario, or ILEO, and they offer legal materials that are translated in different languages that newcomers can access. I think beyond that, it's important that newcomers understand how our democracy works and that they're empowered to speak their voice in their opinion, that they play an important part in our democracy, and that they can speak to their elected officials who are representing them at different levels of government about what they need and what their concerns are. So when we're talking about advocacy, I think that's an important piece, that we empower newcomers and ensure that they know they had the basic understanding of how our democracy works and how civic engagement works. Going to your other question about the landlord-tenant board, a lot has changed since over the last couple of years, and that's primarily not due to COVID, but policies that have been developed for the landlord-tenant board. So by way of background, the landlord-tenant board is a place where landlords and tenants have their disputes heard, and rights and responsibilities are reminded. They remind the parties of what their rights and responsibilities are. Mississauga used to have a central location where counter staff was offered for Mississauga residents. They used to operate 5 days a week. People can just walk in and also hearings were scheduled 5 days a week. And the hearings were dedicated for Peel addresses. It was a place where people can have conversations in the hallways. It was low barrier access, because if you talk to someone in Mississauga and they said, well, where's the landlord-tenant board office? One can just say, well, it's across from the Walmart Square One, or it's across the street from the ODSP office, and people would instinctively know generally how to get there. That all changed, though, in 2020 when remote services were introduced and the landlord-tenant board pulled back and became a remote service model. And so what we have now are a digital barrier for a lot of tenants who don't have the broadband or the tools to participate in those hearings. They also might have language challenges in understanding what their roles are, how to participate. So over the last 3 years, we've heard stories about people having their calls dropped off and not being able to re-enter the hearing room. We've heard stories about how tenants' applications are taking up to 2 years to be heard, and landlord cases up to 6 to 9 months to be heard. These types of delays and challenges on the digital barrier has, is precisely connected to the digital barriers created, because unlike Zoom, when you're in person, you can have multiple conversations. And I said earlier, you also were able to have hallway conversations and have resolutions made between the two parties without anybody from the landlord-tenant board involved. And so that's lost. And so as a result, what we're seeing is that when tenants are being illegally locked out, for example, they're not getting their hearings heard on time. We've heard a story in Eastern Ontario where someone who was illegally locked out in October had their hearing in April about whether or not the landlord lawfully evicted them. And so we're seeing tremendous impact on the housing crisis when the sheriff, I should say, isn't operating right. And so we're also seeing an increase in short-term rentals occupying replacing long-term units in the market, because landlords don't want to deal with the landlord and tenant board anymore and turning their investments into short-term rentals, and thereby pulling a lot of the affordable housing stock from the market. And so these are some of the problems that we're seeing. We're seeing that tenants who could otherwise be connected to the Preventing Homeless and Peel program, the rent bank, to save their tenancy, they're not being connected because they're not at the physical location of the landlord-tenant board. And so a lot of things are being missed, and tenants, lastly, aren't participating by video like the landlord and the adjudicators are. They're participating by phone. And so when you're trying to convince a neutral adjudicator of your position, it's a challenge when you're doing it by phone and you just see a blank screen, far different. And so approximately 55% of tenants who are at the landlord-tenant board are participating by phone, whereas only 25% of landlords are participating by phone. So we're seeing an equal balance of justice happening at the board.
I imagine that would be very difficult too if English is not your first language, for example. So thank you for sharing those issues. We're going to go a little broader now and think about the broader Region of Peel housing needs. So recognizing that the Region of Peel supervises the affordable housing mandate in Mississauga. And according to the region, newcomers or households that immigrated within the last 5 years are 150% more likely to be in need of core affordable housing, which is astonishing. And in addition, the Region of Peel Council report indicated that $4 billion would be required over the next 10 years to maintain the basic level of affordable housing, while an estimated $50 billion would be required to cover 100% of the core housing needs. So considering these constraints, and we're in a time of great change with the Ontario government's plan to dissolve the Region of Peel by January 2025, Aileen, how can we, I guess, address some of these affordable housing issues and avoid some of the disruption issues that may occur with the dissolution?
Yeah, so thank you. And for everyone's benefit, just to make sure we're aware. So as we are dealing with a challenging affordable housing crisis in Peel region, the situation becomes more complex given the fact that the Region of Peel is the service manager for the affordable housing system. We are now in a process with our local municipal partners and the provincial government to dissolve the Region of Peel. And so we're going through a process now to determine how will regional services be delivered in our community. And housing, of course, is just one of several of these services that are now under review, and a new service model will emerge. And there's a transition board in place that's been appointed by the province to oversee this process. And there actually is a website. The transition board has posted a website that you can go and read about the process, and you can actually also provide your feedback about the process. And perhaps actually we can put that website, I can try to put the website address in the chat if that would be helpful. If there's anyone on the call today that's interested in learning more about the dissolution process. So without doubt, it adds some complexity and risk. However, I think we're working very intentionally to minimize that risk, and there's a real commitment on all parties to keep the needs of the vulnerable front and center. So just a couple of examples about what we're doing to mitigate the disruption. So when the dissolution was announced, Regional Council established some principles to guide the dissolution process. And the actual top principle was related to community housing, affordable housing, and the desire to continue to not just maintain service levels, but grow them, and to continue to implement the strategy, the council endorsed strategy that we have in place to address some of the challenges in our community. And so that was a big part of the conversation, so that the need is understood. The need is understood by the transition board. It's understood by regional council and therefore Mississauga council. And so there's a principle to say, carry on. So, and again, not just keep the lights on when it comes to housing, but carry on with the work you had planned to do to increase your budget, to launch new programs. And so that work is continuing. I can just say that all players around the table are committed to doing all we can to minimize disruption, again, particularly to the vulnerable. And so I am personally involved in this process. We're working with our local municipal partners. And so there is a desire, right, to work together to keep the client and the needs of the vulnerable and newcomers front and center as we're making decisions about how these services will be delivered. What I wanted to focus a little bit on today is, part of what I see my role is, and the role of the Peel team, is to ensure that we are transferring knowledge onto the local municipalities in a way that's effective, so that decisions are very informed. And so we talk today about an affordable housing crisis, but we actually talk about there are, in fact, two housing crises. And this is something we really want the local municipalities to understand. So there is a lack of, the one crisis is there's a lack of affordable market housing for middle-income households. And so we've been talking about this. We've been talking about mortgages and rents and how expensive they are. And this is the focus, you'll see a lot in the media, the focus again of the provincial government and increasingly the federal government working with the local municipalities to build more homes, speed up the development process and build more homes. And so I think part of what we're trying to talk to the locals about is that's important. And that's related to supply limitations. And that's going to help middle income households over time. It's not a quick solution, but it is going to help middle income households over time. Really, though, what's important to understand is that there's a second but related housing crisis. And that is a lack of deeply affordable and supportive housing for people with low incomes, and whose housing stability is impacted by, I've just arrived in Canada, or I have trauma, or I have other things in my life that make it just a little more difficult to get and keep housing that we can afford. And so part of what we're trying to help the transition board and the locals understand is this second crisis is where the region of Peel focuses most of our attention. And while these two crises are related, the policy options and the solutions are different. And so I think it's really important that we understand that the solution to the second crisis isn't just building more market housing and speeding up the development process. So we're starting to have very meaningful dialogues, to ensure that the issue is well understood. I guess the last thing I want to say is, this commitment that I've been talking about, I think is most evident in our 2024 budget ask. So if there's anyone on the line that's interested in this, I want to encourage you to go to the Region of Peel's website and look at the region's 2024 budget. We have actually made, there's an increase for budget in housing that's historic. It's the largest single budget increase we've ever requested in the history of the region. And I think it demonstrates that we are trying to, again, despite dissolution, carry on, make the investments that our community needs, and implement new programs while we're figuring out dissolution. So very quickly, just to wrap up, there's a net operating budget increase of $25 million to $180.1 million. That's our net budget. That's the budget that will be paid for by the Region of Peel, not other levels of government. And we have a capital ask of $190 million. And that includes the investments to keep the existing stock, the existing social housing stock, housing that's provided by the Region of Peel and other nonprofit housing providers in a state of good repair. But it's also money to launch a new program to build more, to help the nonprofit sector build more housing. And so there's $71 million being requested to launch a new nonprofit housing development capacity building program. Again, part of the solution is having, as Doug said earlier, we need a public builder. It's important for the government to stay in the housing space because the market has never and will never provide affordable housing, deeply affordable and supportive housing to low-income households and our communities most vulnerable. So again, the last thing I'd like to say is there's also the community has organized. So one of the strategies to mitigate the disruption is not just coming from us, but coming from the community itself with the organization of a group called Metamorphosis. So the nonprofit agencies in our community who serve the vulnerable are also organized and contributing their voice to this process to ensure, again, that the needs of the vulnerable are understood and kept front and center as decisions are made.
Wonderful. And I think we have some of those Metamorphosis members in the audience. So thank you also to those folks for gathering and organizing. Doug, I don't know if you want to weigh in at all in any additional thoughts as the Region of Peel is going through dissolution that you'd like to add?
I think that what the region is doing by continuing with its plan, by working with the lower tier municipalities to bring forward all their good work over the years and policy ideas is fantastic. I think Mississauga should always keep in mind that the 3rd largest city in Ontario and the 7th largest city in Canada. So Mississauga plays a powerful voice when it comes to advocacy, and that when Mississauga speaks, people tend to listen, and so it's important to follow, look for yourselves about some of the policy options that we've spoken about in this presentation, and really bring that voice to all the respective tables that where decision makers sit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And just acknowledging the city as well. In the hypothetical scenario that the service system manager role shifts to the city of Mississauga for affordable housing, Aileen, I don't know if you want to provide any other thoughts on, how the city could approach policy advocacy and system initiatives moving forward, knowing the great experience that you bring.
Yeah, so I guess I want to just emphasize that the transition board has not made any recommendations to the minister, and their recommendations will formally get tabled, I believe, in June. So I just wanted to make sure the group is aware of that. There's been no recommendation made to the province as of yet about how regional services will be delivered, but we're actively engaged with our local municipal partners to help the transition board make the best recommendations possible. So I guess the only thing I would add is to assure people. So all of the City of Mississauga Council sits on regional council, right? So the City of Mississauga Council members are part of regional council, every one of them. That's different from Brampton and Caledon. And so they're well-versed, right? They understand the local issues and they understand the regional issues, and then are very well-versed to continue to lead at this time. I have to say, of course, the City of Mississauga is a very well-run organization, and the staff are committed, very professional, and we work well together, and we're committed to working well together through this process, keeping, again, the needs of our clients front and center, so that we don't skip a beat. And again, as I said earlier, there's commitment certainly on the part of the local municipalities, the transition board, and regional staff to ensure that the process we put in place results in the minimal amount of disruption possible. I think we understand that within this space, the local municipalities don't have the experience of the Region of Peel, and and offering human services is a new role for them, and working with the vulnerable. I believe the city understands that, but they're coming to the table with wanting to listen and learn. So that's part of the process, right? The need to listen and learn and build relationships with the nonprofit sector. That's all going to be very important as the details about how services get developed emerge. There's opportunity, right, to integrate. So I would say continue to take the time to listen and to learn so that your decisions are informed. There's opportunity here to integrate into local services where it makes sense to do so. Clearly, with market housing, there's great opportunity to integrate with the planning function, which we're excited about, but there's also opportunities to make better use of local assets, for example, to serve the vulnerable. So we can see and can get excited about opportunities that this process is creating. So as much as we talk a lot about the risk and we're really wanting to manage it, we also need to talk about the opportunities and what we can do differently and better as a result of this change. So I think finally, I'd like to say, I think, we want the good work that the region is doing to be understood, picked up, and carried on, where it makes sense to do so. And I think I spoke about that in my last response. And again, there's no silver bullet to solving this affordability housing crisis. And so we have a strategy, we have a plan, it's on the mark, it makes sense. And we look forward to sort of transferring that over to whomever picks up our services, and supporting them to just pick up and carry on, because there's a lot of good work happening, and it's important that it continues.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate your collaborative mindset that you both bring to the table, and thinking about such a knotty issue. We're open to questions now, so if anyone wants to put their question in the chat box, please do so. It's in the bottom bar. And thanks to those who have been adding some links into the chat box, including the transition board link from the province. So thanks so much. Maybe one question, Doug, I know you raised a lot of issues around the landlord and tenant board going remote. I guess, is there an approach that you would suggest around advocating for maybe some in-person opportunities so that some of those barriers are reduced?
Thank you for the question. So the landlord tenant board does offer alternatives, but it's not, the forms are not in plain language and not easily accessible as to what other alternatives they offer besides remote. And so MPPs are, the provincial government is responsible for the operations of the landlord and tenant board. And there's been lots of studies about how the digital divide has affected access to justice, as well as delayed significantly the process at the board. And so what I would encourage is having a conversation with your local MPP, tell them your story about your challenges at the board. It's if you look at the notice of hearing, which outlines the date and location of your hearing, before it was only 3 pages, and there was a lot of white space in a box that just says location, address, and whatnot. Now the notice of hearing is 30 pages that describes how to interact in a virtual hearing, and I challenge anyone to look up the notice of hearing and find when the hearing is going to take place. Never mind, if you're not familiar with Zoom, typing in letters and numbers to try to participate. It is quite challenging if you're not familiar with the technology. Even if you're familiar with technology, I think we've all been in situations where in any given week, someone has audio issues or tech issues, and when that's even part of their everyday process. And so never mind people who are unfamiliar with Zoom. And then you add the layer of, well, what's at stake is the next day you could be homeless, or the next day you could lose out on your investment. It's high stakes and high anxiety, and what services that they should be offering is low barrier service like they did before.
Thanks so much, Doug. Glenn has a question about any interesting approaches or initiatives from other municipalities that perhaps Mississauga or Peel could learn from. Maybe I'll start with Aileen.
Yeah, so we talk on a very regular basis to municipalities across Ontario and are aware of leading practices across Canada, around the world. So that very much influences the recommendations that we would take forward to try to implement in Peel. There are lots of examples, right, where the experiences, whether it's in British Columbia or in Finland or in Australia. So for example, when we're talking about homelessness, a recent example is in homelessness with just street outreach. We sort of looked to what was happening just outside of the GTA with working not just with the homeless on the street, but building better relationships with the business community. And so we recognized, we needed to do more to have a balanced approach and more community involvement and engagement. So we launched a pilot called Welcoming Streets. And again, it's just an example of where we had an existing program to support the street homeless, but by looking out and being aware of what others are doing, we could improve our program and have better results, not just for the homeless, but for the community that is impacted by street homelessness and other stakeholders. Modular housing is another example where we've had quite a discussion about modular housing and what's happening around the world and how it's being used for temporary purposes versus permanent purposes and what possibly could work in Peel. Lots of experience with things like home sharing. And this is quite relevant for the newcomer population and what works, whether we try to help asylum claimants find permanent housing faster by a host homes program, or whether we try to understand international students and can we do home sharing with seniors. So we're toying with that idea based on the experience of other jurisdictions. So those are just a few examples, but great question. And yes, it's really important that as we think about what works for Peel, it's informed by leading practices across Ontario, Canada, and around the world.
And just to follow on that, there's a question about partnering with faith communities. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on that as well, if there might be some options.
Yes, so great. So that's we have something called our private stock strategy, and we've identified the faith community as an important stakeholder and inviting them to be a bigger part of the solution for lots of reasons. One, they're also mandate-driven organizations who have a mission to care for the vulnerable. So we often find that we are like-minded with the faith community, but they also are landholders. And so they're also a community that can get involved in potentially using their land for affordable housing. And we certainly had some examples in Peel. In fact, we are slated to go to the Interfaith Council tomorrow to have a discussion with them about some of our challenges and how the faith community could be a bigger part of the solution. So absolutely, they're an important stakeholder. They help us with drop-in programs for the homeless. They operate in a volunteer capacity, but they're also increasingly a solution to build more deeply affordable housing in our community as well.
Thank you so much. Maybe Doug, there's a comment in the chat box from Catherine about landlords moving to short-term rentals. And so I don't know if you'd like to comment on that one as well. In that maybe they have moved to short-term rentals due to the lack of timeliness or fear of the lack of timeliness from the landlord-tenant board. Any comments on that?
I mean, it is something that we're keeping an eye on regarding generally the impact of short-term rentals has on our housing supply. In 2020, when the province suspended operations of short-term rentals, we saw a huge increase in the number of tenants signing long-term leases, which for a short time helped with our housing crisis. And so we know the role that plays. And so there are a lot of negative consequences when we don't have a functioning landlord and tenant board. And just to give you a little bit of context, even in 2018, matters were scheduled for hearing within the majority of applications were scheduled for hearing within 25 days when they had in-person hearings and dedicated hearings for appeal addresses, which, as I said earlier, now it's virtual, and they also schedule matters, appeal matters with Windsor addresses or Toronto or Ottawa address. So it's all bound together and really inefficient. And so in 2018, they had half the number of adjudicators they have now receiving 80,000 applications a day. Right now, I think it's 70,000. And they didn't have such a significant backlog or wait time. So it just really goes to how for at least tribunals where the majority of people are self-represented, how remote has an impact on the way it delivers its services, and also the unintended consequences on the housing market.
Thank you so much. I'll just go to the last two questions here. One is, I guess we're on the brink of a provincial municipal housing summit. And what do our cities need from Queen's Park at the summit to be able to meet local needs? Maybe I'll start with you, Aileen.
Yeah, so I think I'll reiterate my key message, which is we don't just need one thing. We actually need many things, both on the policy side as well as the funding side. So I want to go back to, in terms of housing policy, the provincial government right now is very focused on market housing and increasing supply. And we want to reiterate to the provincial government that's important, and to work collaboratively and in partnership with local municipalities, to address market housing shortages. But we need to continue to advocate to the province that that's not enough. And that's not going to add not one unit of affordable housing for a low-income household or our community's most vulnerable. Right? So they need other policy. They need to continue to invest in what we're calling the community housing sector, which used to be called social housing, but they need investments in community housing, significantly more investments, and policies that recognize the importance of community housing as part of the solution, primarily for low-income and vulnerable members of our population. Thirdly, we also have to help the province understand that health and housing are very interrelated. And so an increasing number of vulnerable members of our society have barriers, health barriers that prevent them from getting or keeping housing that they can afford, whether it's mental health and addiction supports or access to appropriate health supports. And so there's a whole need for the province to understand the relationship between health and housing, and to have more health supports funded and made available to the homeless and other vulnerable members of our community. So all to say, the housing problem is complex, and it's important that the province doesn't try to distill it down to, the problem will be solved if we just build more market supply. That's not accurate, and it's not sufficient, although it's important, but it's not sufficient. And then clearly the province, like the federal government, needs to invest significantly more in this space. And when I say this space, I'm talking about primarily the community housing space. As service manager, the Region of Peel funds 75% of the housing budget on the property tax base, and the property tax base was never intended to carry this type of, it's not appropriate actually for the property tax to be the primary revenue source for this type of social problem. And so there has to be continued advocacy for both the province and the federal government to step in and provide some leadership here. I think it's great that the solutions and the administration can happen locally, because then we understand and can meet local needs, but the funding must come from higher orders of government, and significant shifts are needed, right? So ideally we would have at least a third from the federal government, a third from the provincial government, and local governments picking up perhaps a third. Right now, again, we are funding 75% of the services that are available, and they're not meeting the community's need.
Just to add to that point, Peel has always been underfunded, whether you look at the health sector, housing. And so, and then you add that with all the recent funding announcements by the province and obviously the dissolution of Peel, which puts Peel residents further in the hole, figuratively speaking. And so funding, it's important that at the provincial level that the province recognizes that gap and provides adequate housing. We're also in the midst of an unprecedented homelessness crisis, and we're going into the winter months. And if whatever municipality you're looking at, they don't have enough shelter space to keep people adequately housed and supported. And so the senior levels of government play an important part, both in terms of funding and their jurisdiction to support that the homelessness Ontarians. As well, with the focus on new builds, keep in mind every new building that's going to go online will be exempt from rent control. So at one moment it could be affordable, but then the next moment you could see a 40% rent increase. And so really that the rent control piece cannot be separated from the building of new units. And I agree with what Aileen is saying. We need to focus on what the private market isn't providing, which is deeply affordable community housing. Because without it, we're losing. I think the stat is for every new units that goes online, we're losing 12 affordable units.
Yes.
And so we need to close those loopholes. Ways in which we're losing units is losing them because of the rent control exemptions. We're losing them because of the situation at the landlord tenant board. We're losing them because they're being converted to condos through the financialization of housing. So I mean, I also want to acknowledge that Mississauga played an important part by introducing a rent protection plan, which is one of only 2 municipalities in Ontario to have done so. And so I want to recognize the leadership Mississauga has played in the past. And so it's important that we continue with that advocacy.
On the note of advocacy, thank you so much to you both for those thoughts. There are a few thoughts in the chat box and Q&A of different ideas, whether it be zoning changes for fourplexes on streets that are zoned now only for single homes, or converting office space, or how settlement agencies can advocate for a hub housing model where housing and health and culturally appropriate food, et cetera, can be integrated. Just wondering if you have thoughts on how best to bring forward these ideas and advocate, knowing that you both know sort of the system well in terms of how ideas can turn into policy change. Maybe we'll start with you, Doug, and then we'll go to Aileen.
I'm not a planner, on the converting office space to residential. I do know that it's not as easy as it seems, because you have to ensure that there's plumbing throughout every floor of that office building, that rooms have windows and has to meet the building code. So it's not as easily converted, but it is easier to acquire already built units rather than build them. It's more affordable, but that goes back to ensuring that municipalities, nonprofits, faith organizations have the resources to acquire those units. In terms of zoning changes, I think that's an ongoing conversation in Mississauga to increase density, and elsewhere. The provincial housing action or housing task force that ACTO had participated in about 2 years ago advocate for four units as a right for across the province. We also are advocating for stronger inclusionary zoning policies, which are also helpful. So there's a lot of zoning tools, legislative tools that can be implemented tomorrow that doesn't require funding or paying for building material and putting shovels in the ground, that can have an impact to address the affordable housing crisis.
Perfect. And Aileen, your thoughts on some of these different ideas and how they can be brought to bear through advocacy from maybe a service organization, for example.
Yeah, so I just want to encourage, I love all the ideas. I think, the best way to move them forward is to continue to invest in relationships at both a staff and a political level. So there's certainly opportunities to continue to connect with your local councillor and members of provincial and federal parliament. But I think it's also very important that, as happens today, executive directors of our community agencies connect with myself and other senior leaders at the region and at the local municipal levels, understand and engage in our strategy process, understand what ideas we're already exploring, and just through our relationships, right, make senior staff aware of ideas or projects that are happening elsewhere. So I think operating at both the political and staff level is helpful, and engaging in our planning and strategy processes, right? Because that's where the ideas come from. We develop plans, they get endorsed by council, and we move forward. And so we're committed to trying to ensure that all of our recommendations are informed by stakeholders, clients, as we talked about, leading best practices. So if these ideas can get fed into those processes, they're more likely to be actually translated into recommendations, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I just want to say thank you to both Doug and Aileen for their deep pool of thought and experience, because I think we have a lot of experience around this broader table of audience members as well. And so how can we channel that towards positive change on this issue is really where we're hoping the next step can be. So I'm going to turn it to Glenn to conclude. And I want to thank everyone for your comments and questions and engagement. And hopefully we can use this critical mass to really move forward. So thanks again to the Community Foundation of Mississauga for hosting.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm going to echo some of your thoughts. First of all, I think you did an amazing job of moderating today's session and moving us through this, which is a very complex discussion. I wanted to thank Aileen and Doug as well, for each of you for bringing your unique perspectives to today's discussion, and also for your time commitment in preparing for today's conversation. I also want to extend a thank you to the staff at the Foundation and volunteers in our Community Leadership Committee who have worked really hard to organize today's session. And as we mentioned at the start of the session, a special thank you to our sponsor, Nova Nordisk, who sponsored the entire Vital Conversation series and has been an amazing partner with the Foundation for several years now. And lastly, most importantly, I want to thank everyone who joined us on today's call. I hope you found the conversation interesting. And I think, as Aileen said, we really want to keep the conversation going. So please feel free to reach out to the Foundation with comments and suggestions for how we can help to take action on housing insecurity in our community. Ultimately, the goal of these conversations is not just to sit around and talk about ideas, but to actually turn them into action items. And since we kicked off the Vital Conversation series on newcomers, the Foundation has taken several steps to support newcomers in our community. In May of 2022, we launched the fund, a new endowed fund, the Mississauga Fund for Newcomers. And this fund is intended to generate perpetual grants that will support newcomer programs in our city. We provided $50,000 in matching funding to kick off this initiative. And we're still fundraising behind this initiative today. And anyone can visit the website, the Community Foundation's website, and make a donation to our fund to help grow this fund over time. The Foundation has also generated multiple grants to local agencies to assist with the purchase of essential items such as food, clothing, and school supplies for Ukrainian families that have recently arrived in our community. And after our last Vital Conversation on food insecurity, we've been exploring ways to support food security initiatives in the city. And we have some exciting news that we'll be announcing on this front in the near future. And I bring all of these initiatives to your attention because I want to impress upon everybody who joined the call today that the Foundation is really here to serve the community. So again, please reach out to us. Let us know how we can help, and let's keep this conversation going. And with that, again, thank you to Jessica for moving us through this conversation very quickly. I'm going to give you all back some time in your day. Thank you again for attending today's session, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.